I remember the exact look on Eleanor's face when the judge read the verdict. Pure, uncomprehending shock. It was the face of someone who had never believed in consequences. I had pictured that moment for 482 days. I had logged every expense, tracked every transfer, and mapped every lie to get there. But that victory came much later. The story, my story, began 6 months earlier, in the cold gray of dawn. The hiss of the truck's heater was the only sound. I held the old thermos, my fingers tracing the deep dent near the base. It had been my father's. His hands, calloused and sure, had held it for 30 years. Now mine did. I unscrewed the cap, and a ghost of steam rose in the cab. I poured the black coffee into the lid, but didn't drink. I just let the heat seep into my skin. Outside the windshield, the cranes of the shipping yard moved against the bruised sky. Silent dinosaurs in the mist. This was my grief. A quiet, hollow space in the cab of my Ford F-150. I finally took a sip. The coffee was bitter. An old, familiar pain flickered behind my eyes before the mask slid back into place. An hour later, I walked into the lawyer's office. It was the opposite of my truck. Cold glass, chrome furniture, and air that smelled of nothing. I felt my work boots sink into the plush gray carpet. I was out of place. Eleanor and her fiancé, Marcus, were already there. They looked like they were part of the decor. She wore a black dress that cost more than my monthly mortgage. He was in a dark, tailored suit that shouted money. They belonged. I didn't know it then, but Marcus's condescending appraisal of my worn flannel shirt would be the image I held in my mind when I personally served him his subpoena. Eleanor rose and brushed her cheek against mine. An air kiss. Her perfume was cloying, a sweet smell of decay. Marcus gave me a firm, dry handshake. His grip was a calculation, a quick assessment of my worth. He dismissed me in less than a second. The lawyer, a man I'd never seen before, began to read. His voice was a flat drone, the sound of paperwork. I didn't listen to the words. I watched my sister. I'm a logistics manager. I track patterns. I find tells. Eleanor brought a silk handkerchief to her eye, but the eye was dry. I saw the slight tremor in her hand, a vibration not of grief, but of high-stakes anticipation. I watched Marcus's thumb stroke the back of her hand. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was proprietary. He was claiming his prize. These details were logged away, data points in a system I hadn't yet realized I was building. That single, proprietary stroke would later become Exhibit A in my petition to prove undue influence. Then the lawyer arrived at the relevant clause. The drone stopped. A silence fell in the sterile room. I give, devise, and bequeath the entirety of my estate, he read, including all properties, assets, and holdings, to my daughter, Eleanor Vance. The words hung in the air. I felt nothing, just a strange, distant ringing in my ears. The lawyer cleared his throat. He couldn't quite look at me. To my son, Liam, he continued, I leave my collection of first edition history books, in the hopes that he will finally read them. It was a public execution. The insult was not my father's. I knew his voice, and this was not it. This was Eleanor's work, filtered through Marcus. The air in the room seemed to vanish. It wasn't rage I felt. It was the profound, draining shock of a sudden, deep pressure drop. My knuckles, resting on my knees, turned white. It was the only sign of the impact. The lawyer discreetly gathered his papers and left. He couldn't meet my eyes as he walked out. At that moment, I was no longer a son. I was an administrative inconvenience, an embarrassment to be managed. I had been officially erased. Eleanor turned to me, her face a perfect mask of sympathy. Liam, I had no idea, she said, her voice dripping with pity. Dad never said anything. I'm so sorry. She reached for my arm. I didn't move. We'll make sure you're taken care of course, Marcus added. His tone was the worst of it. The casual charity offered to a beggar. The of course was the twist of the knife. He repeated that exact phrase 9 months later in his deposition, and the utter arrogance of it sealed his fate. They saw a broken man. They expected an outburst. Eleanor held her gaze a little too long, the corner of her mouth twitching with a triumphant smirk. They had their story. The poor, simple brother, left with nothing. I looked past them. My voice came out low and steady. The books, where are they? Their confusion was satisfying. This wasn't in their script. They expected me to plead, to rage, to break. I just wanted my property. My lack of emotion was a foreign variable they could not compute. They didn't see a grieving son. They saw a problem that refused to solve itself. Later, I sat in my truck. The cab was my sanctuary. On the passenger seat was a simple cardboard box. It was filled with old, leather-bound books. I picked one up. The Sinews of War, Army Logistics, 1775 to 1953. I opened the cover. Inside, in my father's familiar, neat script, was an inscription. For Liam, the quiet ones move the world. I ran my thumb over the words. I lifted the book and inhaled. The scent of old paper, of leather, of the faint, sweet aroma of his pipe tobacco. It filled my lungs. This was my inheritance. The quiet understanding between two men who knew the value of unseen work. A single tear escaped and fell onto the page, smudging the ink. It was the first and the last one I shed for him. Night fell. I sat in the dark cab, the world shut out. The raw grief had cooled. It had refined itself into something harder, something colder. Resolve. My hand moved to the glove box. I didn't have to search. I knew exactly where it was. I pulled out the thick, sealed, manila envelope. On the front, in my father's same neat script, was one word. Liam. I didn't open it. I just sat there, in the quiet dark, feeling its weight in my hands. It wasn't a letter. It was a weapon. It was the opening move in a war I never wanted, but was now uniquely equipped to win. The old man's study was an archive of a life. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked, a slow, steady heartbeat in the quiet house. Boxes were stacked against one wall, marked in Eleanor's perfect script. Donate. Eleanor. I ignored them. I was not there to pack. I was there to find a mistake in the data. I sat at his large oak desk, my hand resting on the worn leather blotter where his had rested for 40 years. The room smelled of him, old books and faint, residual pipe tobacco. I picked up his checkbook register. The handwriting was precise, every number perfectly formed. Electric company, grocery, pharmacy. A life lived in neat columns. This was the man I knew, not the stranger who had written that will. I was looking for a deviation, a single entry that didn't fit the pattern. I didn't know it then, but a tiny, $5 charge for coffee would eventually lead me to a holding company in Delaware. A ghost with my name on it. My search for the pattern led me to a diner called the Copper Pot. Vinyl seats, cracked and taped. The clatter of ceramic on the counter. His favorite place. Marge, a waitress who'd worked there since I was a kid, poured me a coffee. She had a kind, tired face. Was he acting any different, Marge? I asked. The last month or so? She wiped the counter with a damp cloth. Same as always, Liam. 2 eggs over easy, bacon crisp. Paid cash. She paused. Oh, but he did have that new driver. Young fella. Drove him out to Oak Haven one Tuesday. Said his eyes weren't great for highway driving anymore. Oak Haven. A flashing light on my mental map. A destination with no corresponding entry in his register. That night, in my small apartment, I put the pieces together. My laptop was open to a simple spreadsheet. Date. Activity. Location. Source. I was building a timeline. I found the charge from a local car service on his Bank of America statement. The date matched a Tuesday he had circled on his wall calendar. No entry, just a circle. I cross-referenced his phone bill. A single, 1-minute call to a number with an Oak Haven area code. Made that same morning. It was a triangulation. A shipment plotted from scattered, meaningless data points. I would use this exact method a year later to trace Marcus's offshore accounts, and the digital paper trail was just as clear. I dialed the Oak Haven number. A tinny, bored voice answered. Professional services. I used my logistics voice. Calm. Unimportant. The voice that gets a stuck container released from customs. Hi. I'm settling my father's estate, I said. He used a service in your building a few weeks back. I'm just trying to track down a receipt. The receptionist read from a script about privacy. A wall of procedure. I didn't push. I pivoted. I understand completely, I said. Could you just confirm if you have a notary public on site? That would narrow my search immensely. There was a pause. A sigh of annoyance. Yes, we do. A click. A small, clean victory. The next day I was ambushed in the frozen foods aisle of a Kroger. I was staring at pints of Breyer's vanilla, my mind miles away in Oak Haven. Liam. I didn't expect to see you here. Eleanor. She was with Marcus, both of them glowing with a kind of predatory wellness. She started talking about the house. her voice bright and brittle with excitement. "We have to gut the whole kitchen, of course," she said, picking up a carton of organic kale. Dad's taste was so dated. The casual cruelty of it landed like a punch to the ribs. Dated. His life, his home, everything he was, erased with a single word. Marcus put a heavy, familiar hand on my shoulder. "Don't you worry, pal," he said, his voice slick with false sincerity. "We're making sure the family legacy is in good hands. Building on it, you know? Building on it." I would remember that phrase. I would play the recording of him saying it during his fraud deposition and watch the color drain from his face. But in that moment, I just nodded. I grabbed the ice cream. "I've got to go," I said. My quiet was an armor they saw as a white flag. They were wrong. That evening, I went through a box from the garage. Inside was his old tackle box. It smelled of lake water and rust. I opened it. Among the lures was a single red devil spoon, its red paint chipped along the edge. My thumb found the worn spot. Suddenly, I was 12 years old, in a small boat on a sun-dappled lake. His voice, warm and patient, was in my ear. "Patience, son. You don't horse the fish in. You just keep a steady pressure. They'll tire themselves out." I closed the box. It was the only lesson I needed. Steady pressure. The next morning, I was in Oak Haven. I sat in my truck across the street from a small, unassuming office. The sign was simple: Alistair Finch, attorney at law and notary public. I had found him by reverse searching the phone number. This was it, the destination. But I didn't move. I pulled out my phone and called my father's doctor. "Dr. Evans, it's Liam Connolly," I said. "I have a question about my dad's last checkup." "Yes, the one on the 14th. I paused. "Can you confirm for his estate records that you found him to be of sound mind and memory?" A small flame of hope ignited in my chest. The doctor confirmed it. The appointment was the day before the trip to Oak Haven. My father hadn't just changed his will. He had created a bulletproof manifest. A set of data points that only a logistics man would know how to read. A message left for me. I had the final piece. I knew what he had done. My hand went to the door handle, ready to cross the street and end it. But I stopped. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The grieving son was gone. The fixer was looking back. I pulled my hand back from the door. I put the key in the ignition and the engine rumbled to life. The lawyer wasn't the next step. Not yet. The board wasn't ready. First, you let your opponents overextend their supply lines. You let them get comfortable. I pulled away from the curb, driving away from the answer. Knowing the truth was only half the battle. The other half was logistics. It was just beginning. Chaos is never random. It's always a single, overlooked detail. I learned that in the deafening hum of the logistics hub. A junior manager was sweating, staring at a tablet as if it were a bomb. A shipment of critical medical supplies, 2 tons of it, was on its way to Anchorage. The destination was Atlanta. "It'll take a week to reroute," he stammered. "We're going to lose the contract." I ignored the noise, the forklifts, the panic. I looked at a shipping label on a nearby box. I took the tablet from his shaking hands. My fingers moved through the digital pathway, tracing the route. I found it in seconds. A single transposed digit in a routing code. A typo. "It's not a system error," I said, mostly to myself. "It's a human one." I made 2 calls. I spoke in the quiet language of container numbers and flight schedules. I intercepted the shipment during a layover in Seattle. I rerouted it. The crisis was over. A massive failure, averted by finding one small mistake. My father's will was a misrouted shipment. I just had to find the typo. The search led me to a phone call with my Aunt Carol. I made it from my truck during lunch, a half-eaten ham sandwich on the passenger seat. I kept my voice low, mournful. "I'm just trying to get Dad's affairs sorted," I told her. "It's a lot. Eleanor seems to have it all in hand. She found that new lawyer so quickly." I let the silence hang there. A baited hook. She took it. "Oh, that was all Marcus, dear," she said, her voice full of gossip. "A real go-getter, that one. He said his firm, Thorne and Associates, uses Mr. Jennings for all their sensitive estate planning. A real top-flight man." The words hit me like a physical shock. Marcus. Sensitive. It was the first cold, heavy piece clicking into place. It was this conversation I would later have to recount in a sworn affidavit, a memory that would help strip Marcus of his license. That night, I sat in my dark apartment, the forged will on the table beside my laptop. I typed the names of the 2 witnesses into the search bar. Richard Stowe, Alan Croft. I didn't bother with Facebook. I went to LinkedIn. Their profiles were slick, corporate. Stowe was an investment partner. Croft was a risk management consultant. I clicked on Stowe's list of connections and started scrolling. Then I saw it. A shared connection. Marcus Thorne. I clicked over to Croft's profile. Same name. Same smiling, predatory headshot. The glow of the screen lit my face. They weren't witnesses. They were soldiers in Marcus's army. The next day I confirmed it. I was parked in my F-150 across from a steakhouse called the Capitol Grill, the kind of place where men celebrate victories. At 1 o'clock, Marcus walked out of his office building 2 blocks away. He was met on the sidewalk by 2 men in identical expensive suits. I recognized them from the LinkedIn photos. Stowe and Croft. Marcus clapped Stowe on the back and they all laughed, loud and easy. They walked into the restaurant. The final, visceral proof. 3 thieves, going to lunch. I watched them through the large plate glass window. The maitre d' showed them to a prime table. I watched them order drinks, their gestures broad and confident. Marcus told a story and the other 2 roared with laughter. They raised their glasses in a toast. The image triggered a memory. My father, just a few months ago, sitting in his favorite armchair. He looked small. His hand trembled as he tried to sign my birthday card, the pen unsteady. The vibrant, laughing energy of the men in the restaurant and the memory of my father's fading life collided inside me. It was a sickening contrast. The hope I found in Oakhaven burned away, replaced by a pure, cold rage. My hand tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles were white. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was a celebration. A feast after a successful hunt. I couldn't sleep that night. I drove to my father's house and walked through the silent, empty rooms. In his bedroom, I opened the top dresser drawer. I took out his watch. A simple, elegant Seiko with a worn leather band. It wasn't worth much, but it was his. I sat on the edge of the bed and held it. I imagined him in this room, in those last months, while the vultures circled. Did he know? Was he scared? "I'm sorry, Dad." I whispered into the darkness. "I'm sorry I wasn't paying attention." The guilt was a physical weight. Not for the money. For the failure to protect him. I strapped the old watch to my wrist. It felt heavy. A responsibility. Back at my apartment, the rage had cooled into purpose. I kept digging. I ran a public records search on Marcus's firm and the businesses of his 2 witnesses. I found it on a city planning website. An application for a new commercial development, a high-end boutique hotel. Eleanor's dream project. The primary investors were 3 new ghost companies. On paper, they didn't exist. But the money inside them was real. My money. LLC 1 was registered to Marcus Thorne. LLC 2 was registered to Richard Stowe. LLC 3 was registered to Alan Croft. The application was filed 3 days before my father died. They weren't hoping to get the inheritance. They were already spending it. They were building their future on his grave before he was even in it. Those LLCs, designed to hide their crime, would become the very things that exposed them. I stood before the corkboard on my wall. It was a map of their lives. Photos of Eleanor, Marcus, Stowe, and Croft were in the center. Red yarn connected them, a web of deceit. The shock had settled. What was left was ice. I walked to the metal footlocker in my closet, unlocked it, and took out the thick manila envelope. The one with my name on it. I sat at my desk and, for the first time, I broke the seal. I pulled out the document inside. The real will. I read it. My father had seen it all coming. The shock on my face melted away, replaced by a grim, profound respect. He hadn't just left me an inheritance. He had left me a meticulously crafted trap. A playbook. I looked from the will in my hands to the board on the wall. The hunt was over. The war was about to begin. Complex systems are controlled by small levers. A port strike in Rotterdam can shut down a factory in Shanghai. Everyone sees the chaos. They never see the lever. My colleague Brenda saw the chaos. "It's a nightmare, Liam," she said, leaning over my cubicle wall. Her voice was tight with stress. "The strike has a knock-on effect. A dozen clients are screaming. There's no way to fix it." I didn't look at her. I looked at the flowchart on my screen, a web of arrows and codes stretching across 3 continents. I ignored the screaming red icons that meant delayed. I found a single, quiet node in southern Spain. Port of Algeciras. A single container of olives. I clicked on it. I rerouted it. On the screen, a cascade began. A dozen red icons flickered, one by one, to green. The entire system began to flow again. Check your system now, Brenda, I said without looking up. That's how I saw my war. A complex system of lies. I just had to find the right lever. The target was delivered to me by pure arrogance. I was at my father's house, packing the last of his history books. Eleanor was walking through the living room, shouting into her phone at Marcus. She assumed I was just part of the furniture. The Beaumont building, she said, her voice sharp. The moment probate clears, we make the offer. It's the cornerstone of the entire Vance Holdings portfolio, babe. Perfect location. My back was to her. I held a dusty copy of Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I paused for a single beat, then carefully placed the book in a box. I had my target, the Beaumont building. The next day, I visited an old contact from the freight world. His office was above a check-cashing place, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and old paper. The sign on the door said, Rick's Paralegal and Process. Rick was a man who operated in the gray spaces between the lines. Rick, I said, I need a new LLC. A ghost. Untraceable. He didn't look up from his crossword puzzle. What are we importing? Hypothetically, I said, specialized masonry anchors from Portugal. High-tensile steel rebar from Turkey. Custom-milled hardwoods from Brazil. He finally looked up, a slow grin spreading across his rumpled face. This was the kind of logistical problem he enjoyed. Hypothetically, that sounds complicated. Give me an hour and a name for this ghost. I glanced at a worn paperback on his shelf. Odyssey, I said. Odyssey Global Imports. That ghost company would, 15 months later, be the subject of a frantic, multi-state forensic audit by Marcus's legal team. They never found a thing. That night, on a secure laptop, I began to build my machine. I wasn't hacking. I was weaving. Using Odyssey Global, I filed legitimate, multi-stage shipping manifests with the holding company that owned the Beaumont building. I created contingent receiving contracts. I buried them in a mountain of invisible red tape. I designed a shipment of masonry anchors from Portugal that didn't exist. Their delivery was dependent on a specialty resin from Germany that also didn't exist. That resin required a customs pre-clearance dependent on a tariff code that was under official review. It was a perfect, legal, and completely immovable paper jam. I wouldn't hear the recording of the subsequent phone call until the discovery phase of the lawsuit, but I have it memorized. I can still hear the tight fury in Eleanor's voice, broadcast over a speakerphone in her pristine office. What do you mean, Port Authority hold? She'd shrieked. It's a building. It doesn't have a port. The current owners signed a receiving contract, her lawyer's tired voice explained, for some specialized construction materials. Until the shipment clears customs, there's a federal lien against the property's transfer of title. It's unusual. Then cancel the contract. Marcus had barked. We can't, the lawyer replied. The shipper, a company called Odyssey Global, has already paid a non-refundable deposit. Breaking the contract would trigger millions in international penalties. According to the transcript, that was when Eleanor's Montblanc pen audibly cracked in her fist. A few days later, I stood before my father's grave. The late afternoon sun was warm. It was peaceful. I wasn't there to report a victory. I was just there. I reached down and pulled a single, stubborn weed from the base of the headstone, then brushed the dirt from my hands. She always hated that kitchen, I said to the quiet air. Said you had no taste. A short, sad laugh escaped me. It was a conversation only he would understand. Marcus's deposition was the first time I learned how quickly he suspected the truth. He was smarter than Eleanor. She saw incompetence. He saw a professional. International penalties? He recounted on the witness stand, his voice flat. Customs liens? Specialized shipping contracts? I told her, this isn't random. This is targeted. It's too precise. The lawyer asked him what he did next. I remember leaning forward, waiting for the answer I already knew. He had gone back to his office that night, digging into the digital ghost I had created. He hit dead ends everywhere. He described his frustration, the feeling of being outmaneuvered. Then, he said, a thought occurred to him. An idea so ridiculous he almost dismissed it. The phone records we subpoenaed confirmed it. A call from his office to Eleanor's cell phone at 11:32 p.m. I can picture him there, staring at his screen, at the contact information he'd pulled up for me, staring at my job title, Senior Logistics Coordinator. Ellie, he'd said into the phone, the seed of paranoia planted. I have a crazy idea. It's probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. For the first time, they were forced to consider the quiet, inconvenient man they had erased. They were forced to wonder if the ghost in their machine had a name. My name. The loneliness started before they came for me. It started in the fluorescent hum of the office break room. A sad sheet cake from a grocery store sat on the table. Someone was singing "Happy Birthday" to Brenda, our perpetually stressed office manager. I sang along, my voice a low murmur in the off-key chorus. I stood by the coffee machine with a paper plate, the slice of cake unnaturally white. I watched my colleagues make small talk. Easy, mundane. The machinery of human connection that I had never learned to operate. A guy named Dave clapped me on the shoulder. "Big plans for the weekend, Liam?" I gave a small shrug that meant nothing. I took a bite of cake. The frosting was chalky, painfully sweet. In a building full of people, I was an island. I was a misrouted shipment, sitting in the wrong port, 1,000 miles from where I belonged. The attack came through the phone. It was a coordinated, multi-front assault, and Eleanor was the tip of the spear. I can picture her in her Mercedes, parked, checking her makeup in the vanity mirror as she performed her grief for our Aunt Carol. Her voice, a perfect instrument of sorrow. "I'm just so worried about him, Aunt Carol," she would have said. "He thinks Dad wasn't himself at the end. It's like Liam is inventing conspiracies to cope. It's tearing me apart to see him trying to undermine Dad's final wishes." Each word was a weapon wrapped in velvet. Marcus was the ground support. He ambushed my cousin David at a weekend farmer's market, holding a bag of organic apples like a shield of wholesomeness. "Between you and me," he'd say, his voice full of that false, deep sincerity, "I'm worried about Liam. He barely spoke to his father that last year. I think he's feeling guilty and lashing out. He's making things difficult." He twisted my quiet nature into a weapon against me. He poisoned the past. The poison spread quickly. I was in my apartment when the barrage began. My phone lay on the kitchen counter, lighting up with each new betrayal. A text from a cousin. "Did you really say Dad was losing his mind? What is wrong with you?" An email from my Uncle Paul, the subject line a stark accusation, "Your father's memory." Missed calls from Aunt Margaret. 1, 2, 3. A voicemail notification appeared. I stared at the phone. It was no longer a tool. It was a snake. I finally answered when Aunt Margaret called again. She was my father's older sister, the family's matriarch, its true north. Her opinion was law. Her voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was heavy with a deep, bottomless disappointment. It was the same voice she used when I broke her antique vase as a child. "Liam, I'm only going to say this once," she said, the words cold and clear. "Your father was a proud man. This narrative you are spinning, that he was confused, that he was not in control of his faculties, it is a deep and selfish cruelty." "Aunt Margaret, that's not what's happening," I said, my own voice strained, almost unrecognizable. "Your sister is trying to hold this family together," she cut in, "and you are trying to tear it apart because you are unhappy with the outcome. Stop it. Let your father rest in peace. Let us all rest." The line went dead. The click was the loudest sound I had ever heard. She had not only taken their side, she had convicted me of dishonoring my father's memory, the very thing I was fighting to protect. It would be 2 years before I heard her voice again, when she was compelled to testify under oath. I walked numbly to the garage. The air smelled of sawdust and old oil. My father's scent. On his workbench was a half-finished jewelry box, the dovetail joints so precise they looked like they had grown that way. A gift for someone. Maybe my mother. Maybe Eleanor. A man called Confused could not create something this perfect. A mind that could execute these intricate cuts was not losing it. I picked up a piece of sandpaper and a block of wood and sat on his stool. I began to sand, the steady, rasping sound filling the silence. I sanded until my knuckles were raw, the physical pain a welcome distraction. Later, packing the last of the books from his study, I found it. A letter from his investment manager at Morgan Stanley, dated 2 weeks before he died. It confirmed, in dry financial language, that my father had personally directed the reallocation of his entire portfolio. A shrewd, aggressive move to capitalize on a market shift. It was irrefutable proof of a sharp, strategic mind. The truth, right there in my hands. I slumped against the wall, the letter crinkling in my fist. A wave of utter desolation washed over me. It didn't matter. The facts were irrelevant. Eleanor and Marcus had crafted a better story. A story of a confused old man, a devoted daughter, and a bitter, greedy son. My family had chosen the lie because it was easier. The villains had won the narrative. I was completely and utterly alone. That night, I sat in my truck in an empty industrial lot. The city lights were a cold, distant glow. The engine was off. I was broken. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, the weight of it all crushing me. A single tear ran down my cheek. My hand idly twisted the watch on my wrist. His watch. My fingers felt the worn leather, the cool metal. And then I heard his voice, a faint memory from a sun-dappled boat. You don't horse the fish in. You just keep a steady pressure. They'll tire themselves out. My breathing steadied. I lifted my head. The despair was gone, burned away and replaced by something cold and hard. They thought they had won because they controlled the story. They had just given me the final piece of mine. Their arrogance was the lever. I picked up my phone, the screen illuminating my face. I opened an encrypted messaging app, a chat with R. I typed a short, simple message. I need you to leak a rumor to a friend of Marcus Thorne. One sentence. I paused, then typed the sentence that would make them tear their own conspiracy apart. Liam Connolly has a second will. I hit send. This wasn't a move to win. It was a move to begin the hunt. I was no longer reacting. I was applying pressure. The despair burned away, leaving behind a cold, clean machine. That night, in my silent apartment, I sat at the kitchen table and worked. In front of me were the inner workings of my father's old mantel clock, a complex tangle of frozen gears and springs. It hadn't ticked in years. With a jeweler's loop pressed to my eye, my hands were steady. I used delicate tweezers to navigate the mechanism. The problem, as always, was a single point of failure. One small, bent gear, rusted in place, had seized the entire system. I carefully removed it, straightened it with pliers, cleaned it, and slotted it back into place. The work was precise, purposeful. I was no longer grieving. I was fixing a broken machine. I closed the back of the clock, placed it on the table, and gently swung the pendulum. A deep, resonant tick-tock began to fill the silence. A steady, implacable heartbeat. It was the sound of the war starting again. The first move required an expert in the gray spaces. I met Rick in a greasy spoon diner on the industrial side of town. The air was thick with the smell of bacon and burnt coffee. I slid a plain envelope across the sticky vinyl of the table. I need a rumor delivered, I said. Not an email, not a text. A piece of bar talk. Rick picked up the envelope but didn't open it. Who's the audience? Marcus Thorne. And the message? I looked him in the eye. The message is, I heard the brother has another will. Rick gave a slow, deliberate nod. He understood. A whisper is a more dangerous weapon than a shout. The plan he laid out was simple. He would find the weakest link in Marcus's circle, a junior analyst, eager for gossip. He would plant the seed in a loud, expensive bar where it was guaranteed to grow. I didn't need to see it happen. I just needed to watch for the result. The confirmation came 2 days later. I was parked in my truck a block from Marcus's office building. I wasn't watching him. I was watching the patterns of traffic around his world. At 2:17 p.m., Eleanor's black BMW sedan pulled up, parking illegally in a commercial loading zone. She stormed out of the car and into the building, her face a mask of rage. Minutes later, they appeared in the window of a high-floor conference room. I couldn't hear them, but I didn't need to. She was pacing like a caged animal. He was running his hands through his hair, over and over. The bait had been taken. I would later read the transcript of their conversation, obtained during discovery. It was exactly as I had pictured it. His paranoid caution against her blinding arrogance. It could be nothing, Marcus had said, trying to convince himself. A bluff. A scare tactic. Of course it's a bluff, she'd spat back. He's a logistics manager, for God's sake. He doesn't have the guts or the imagination. Her contempt for me was her fatal flaw. It made her predictable. But what if he found something? Marcus had pressed. We have to be careful, Ellie. We have to find out what he has. No, she'd hissed, her voice venomous. We do not play his game. We crush him. We make our will so legally airtight that any pathetic scrap of paper he produces becomes a joke. We end this. Now. The next morning, I went to my father's diner. The Copper Pot. I sat in his booth. Marge came over, her face etched with a familiar, weary kindness. Haven't seen you in a while, she said, pouring coffee into a thick ceramic mug. You doing okay, honey? Getting there, Marge, I said, and for the first time in months, it felt true. I ordered his breakfast. 2 eggs over easy, bacon crisp. I ate it slowly. It was a ritual, a moment of quiet connection to the man I was fighting for, a reminder to be patient, to let them tire themselves out. Eleanor's arrogance delivered the victory. The court documents told the story. Her lawyer, a man named Jennings, advised caution. Marcus had hesitated, but Eleanor, convinced of her own power, had insisted on a final, crushing move. An injunction is an aggressive move, Jennings had warned them. I want a definitive, final, court-ordered validation of my father's wishes, she had declared, her voice iron. I want it on the public record. I want any and all other claims to be rendered null and void before they can even be made. She thought she was firing a cannon. She had just pulled the pin on her own grenade. Her demand to have the forged will validated by the court was the single greatest strategic error she could have made. It was the one move that gave my father's true will an immediate, legal path to be heard. That night, I sat in my truck. The engine was off. The city was a distant, indifferent glow. The only light was from my phone, lying face up on the passenger seat. The only sound was the steady tick-tock of my father's watch on my wrist. I was just waiting. A soft ding broke the silence. I picked up the phone. A notification from the legal document service I'd subscribed to. Subject: Case hashtag 78B 441. Estate of Edward Connolly. New filing. I tapped it open. The official court filing filled the screen, stamped and dated. The words at the top were stark. Emergency injunction to validate and enforce last will and testament. I leaned my head back against the seat, the phone's glow illuminating my face. There was no joy. There was no victory. Only the profound, somber weight of an endgame set in motion by my father's foresight and my sister's pride. The trap, so patiently set, had finally sprung. The silence in the cab was absolute. On the morning of the final day, I sat at my kitchen table and polished my father's watch. The clock on the mantelpiece, the one I had repaired, kept time with a steady, resonant tick. Its rhythm was the only sound in the apartment. My hands moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, the soft cloth gliding over the cool metal and worn leather. This was not preparation for a battle. It was a final act of respect, a quiet ritual to honor the man who had built the machine. I finished, strapped the watch to my wrist, and checked the time. It was perfect. I was ready. The first step was the summons. I made the call from my truck during my morning coffee break. Eleanor answered on the second ring. I kept my voice flat, neutral, the same tone I would use to confirm a container's arrival in port. Eleanor, I said, there are some outstanding details regarding Dad's estate. My lawyer has scheduled a final meeting to resolve them. It's at Jennings' office. 3 o'clock. I did not ask. I informed. The cold, procedural nature of the call seemed to unnerve her. There was a pause. I could hear the condescending curiosity in her voice when she agreed, certain I was coming to beg for scraps. The second step was the witness. I drove to Oakhaven. The office of Alistair Finch smelled of old paper and integrity. He was an elderly man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He handed me a signed, notarized affidavit. Your father was a good man, he said, his voice raspy with age. Said you were the one who always read the instructions before you built the toy. Knew you'd figure it out. The last step was the strategist. My lawyer, Anna Reed, had an office that was modest, sharp, and pragmatic. On her desk lay the 2 wills and the injunction Eleanor had filed. Anna tapped the injunction with the tip of her pen. They could have just ignored the rumor, she said, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across her face. But they couldn't stand the thought of you having anything. Their arrogance made them sign their own confession. She looked at the real will. Your father didn't just write a will. He built a perfect machine. We met in the same sterile conference room where I had been erased. Eleanor and Marcus sat on one side of the polished table, radiating smug victory. Anna and I sat on the other. All right, Liam, we're very busy, Eleanor began, her voice dripping with impatience. What is this about? If you're here for a handout, you can submit a request in writing. I said nothing. I slid the thick envelope my father had left me to the center of the table. Eleanor scoffed. Oh, this is pathetic, she said. A forged will. Really? Anna calmly opened the envelope. This is the last will and testament of Edward Connolly, notarized by Mr. Alastair Finch on October 14th. At that exact moment, the conference room door opened and Mr. Finch walked in. He nodded to me and took a seat quietly in the corner. I saw the first flicker of unease in Marcus's eyes. Anna then produced the sworn affidavit from my father's doctor, confirming his sound state of mind on the day before his trip to Oakhaven. The color began to drain from Marcus's face. He knew. The will is quite simple, Anna continued, her voice even. The estate is to be liquidated and the proceeds split 50-50 between his two children. Eleanor let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Before she could speak, Anna held up a hand. However, she said, there is one specific codicil. She paused, letting the words hang in the silent, sterile air. She then slid a copy of the emergency injunction across the table. Her finger came to rest on Eleanor's signature. Should any legal dispute regarding this inheritance be initiated by one of my children against the other, Anna read, the full cost of all legal fees and associated expenses for both parties shall be deducted solely from the initiator's share. Silence. A profound, crushing silence. I watched my sister's face, a canvas of disbelief slowly collapsing into the pure horror of comprehension. She hadn't just lost half the estate. Her own greed, her own attack, had sprung the trap. In that deafening quiet, I did not look at her. I did not look at Marcus, who sat beside her like a deflated balloon. I glanced down at the watch on my wrist. I ran my thumb over the smooth, clean crystal. The steady tick-tock was a silent shout in the room. It's done, Dad. The machine worked. Eleanor finally found her voice, a ragged whisper. And the rest of it? After the fees? Anna looked at me. It was my move. I looked at my sister, really looked at her for the first time that day. My voice was quiet and clear. The clause stipulates the choice of charity for any remaining balance is mine. I've chosen the Legal Aid Foundation for victims of financial fraud. The words landed like a physical blow, but Anna wasn't finished. She consulted her notes. And the foundation has already confirmed, she said, that a donation of this size will fund their lead counsel's chair for the next decade. They'll be installing a small plaque in their reception hall. She looked directly at Eleanor. Generously endowed by the Eleanor Vance Fund. Her name, the source of all her pride, would now be an eternal monument to her own corruption. The ruin was absolute. The meeting was over. I left them there, hollowed-out shells in a glass box. I walked out of the building into the bright afternoon sun. I walked past the line of expensive cars and got into my old Ford truck. On the passenger seat was the cardboard box of history books. My true inheritance. I put the key in the ignition and the engine rumbled to life. I pulled out into the street, merging seamlessly into the afternoon traffic. Just another truck in the steady, anonymous flow of the city. Justice had been delivered, not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless precision of a logistical plan. The quiet man, the one no one ever saw, was simply going back to work.